Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Mandy Morello, and I'm a student representative for UNICEF at the University of Michigan. For World Health Day 2021, UNICEF UM is conducting a week-long initiative to raise awareness for global childhood malnutrition and start a conversation about the realities of child malnutrition and its implications on children around the globe. Today, I'm sitting down with Dr. Laura Jana, a US-based pediatrician, health communicator, social entrepreneur, award-winning parenting and children's book author, and University of Michigan alumnus. Dr. Jana, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's great to join you.
Thank you. Our conversation today is going to focus on poverty as it pertains to childhood nutrition or lack thereof, and contributing factors to social inequities around the world. Before we get into the complexities of the poverty crisis, however, can we begin the conversation by defining the components of childhood nutrition and how we measure childhood health?
Sure, and it's great to hear that you're tackling some really big issues. I mean, there's a lot of directions you could take that in. And as a pediatrician, what I've found often is that you get people who are very specifically focused on the core nutrients, and then you get people who are focused on whether it's food marketing to children or obesity. But taking a step back and doing what you're doing now, and what we're going to talk about is looking at it as sort of a bigger picture. Because not everybody says, oh, poverty, nutrition. But what we know, and again, it's intuitive once we talk about it, is that with poverty comes significant issues around nutrition. And what's been striking, especially in the last decade or two, is that on the one hand, you see malnutrition, which is what we oftentimes have as images in our head of children who are malnourished. Um, but we also have this dual issue with obesity at the same time. And people kind of think, well, obesity is related to too much to eat and then gaining too much weight. The challenge is it's not just how much you get to eat, but what you get to eat and the quality of it. So when we look at childhood nutrition as a whole, there's a lot of elements, I mean, as you're alluding to, there's a lot of elements to consider. And one is the nuts and bolts of it. How much iron and calcium and vitamin D and all those sort of core nutrients do children need. And what we certainly find globally and in kids living in low resourced areas, low income countries, high poverty areas, is a definite lack of nutrients. So you get micronutrient deficiencies, and you can oftentimes tell based on the kinds of diets they eat which nutrients are missing in their diet. And we can see very specific impacts on their health, whether it's how their eyes develop and their vision. We certainly can see impacts on brain development and IQ, all those sorts of things. But we also then have to look at a little bit of a bigger level and say, what is the quality of food that they're eating? Right. So if you're drinking soda and eating candy bars or low cost fast foods, you may be getting the calories you need, but you have another type of malnutrition. Again, not getting the nutrients you need, and you're getting lots of calories for very little kind of the sort of energy that you need, right? Like the quality of what you're getting is not good for the number of calories you're getting. So if that helps, again, there's all these levels of how we look at childhood nutrition. And then the last part of this, since I know we're going to get into some of these big issues, is helping people take a step back and just think about the fact that when we talk about global childhood poverty and nutrition, that in areas, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa or even in the US in areas of high poverty, a lot of families have to decide between getting their kids education, right? If you live in a farming village in Africa and you are having to make the tough decision of, do you pay the fees to send your child to school or do you feed your family? And so we even see at that level that education, which is seen as hope for the future, right? The whole family is better off if a child can get educated and then do better and do better for the family. At the same time, you often are sacrificing the food that the others in the family get to be able to afford it. So you see a lot of things tied together, whether it's climate, education, health, all of those things tied together with nutrition.
And to build on that poverty idea, in the United States, we see that fresh produce and organic meat or dairy is often incredibly expensive. So families who are living at or below the poverty line oftentimes fall back on the pops and the sugary candies. Um, so for this conversation, it's important to understand that that is a massive impact on childhood nutrition, childhood health, but it's also it also earmarks this poverty crisis in the United States. So, for understanding poverty, can you tell us how it's quantified and how might it vary from place to place? So, certainly it's different in sub Saharan Africa
Right.
than a low income neighborhood in the United States. But what do you view the poverty crisis as?
Sure. And in a broad sense, I mean, there's very specific dollars per day that we'll get into, but in a broad sense, it's been very interesting since some of the work I've done is US based. A good bit of the work I've done is US based, but I also have been to areas around the world, whether it's, a slum sort of township outside of Cape Town, South Africa, or rural Honduras, or villages in India. And on the one hand, I have to say I've come back from some of those trips thinking that we don't know what poverty is in America, right? I mean, we're a very wealthy country. At the same time, that is not meant to minimize. We have far too many, right? Far too many kids living in poverty. And so we need to address it. But you're right, globally, what's defined as extreme poverty, this usually blows people away, right? When they hear the numbers. Globally, extreme poverty is defined as less than $1.90 per day earnings, right? Now, I don't know a lot of students or adults in the US who would work for $1.90 an hour, right? So this idea of making less than $1.90 per day is extreme poverty, but then you get I think the next level up, sort of the moderate poverty level is something like $3.20 a day. And then the next higher up tier is $5 something cents per day. So again, you do need to kind of look at how are we defining it. But even in the US, what we tend to use here is living below the poverty line, or 100% or 200%, above poverty or below poverty. And that's set depending on the number of people in the family. Because again, for an individual versus a family of four, those numbers change a little bit. But what we know is it's the cost of living to be able to not be food insecure, housing insecure, all those things that we really want to avoid. Because one of the sayings I like best, and one of the things I focus on as somebody who's really committed to helping improve children's life outcomes, is that unfortunately we're not getting every child out of poverty anytime soon, as much as I would love that to be my goal. But there are lots of things that we can do to buffer the effects of poverty. One of the things I focus on is the buffering of what is considered the neurotoxic effects of poverty, right? Poverty's effects on brain development and IQ and learning abilities and things. But tied right in with that is the neurotoxic and whole body toxic effects of malnutrition and micronutrient deficiency and obesity and all those other things.
So, to build off of that, it's clear that poverty overlaps with these global issues, and that definitely affects the income people are getting in a day, or the neurotoxins in children's brains. Um, and the United Nations right now is currently reporting that we're not on track to meet the second sustainable goal, development goal of achieving zero hunger by 2030. And these aforementioned political crises that you had talked about, but also climate change, social unrest, economic recessions, have now left over 690 million people suffering from acute hunger. What are your thoughts on this?
It's interesting to think about, we tend to, with the pandemic, right? We tend to focus in on what is most threatening to us at the time. Like that's just how people are wired, how our brains work. So the initial response to the pandemic is very specific to COVID, for example, right? And it's about the virus and how do you get it and how do you keep from spreading it, and everybody's very afraid. And then we figure out what we need to be afraid of and what we don't, and we find that masks work, and then we scramble and we make vaccines. But as soon as anyone, unfortunately, there were people who very early on could take a step back and look at the broader picture. What happens with something like a pandemic or a natural disaster and climate change or a financial crisis is that it puts stress on the system. And anytime you have stress on any system, what you start to see is the weak points, the points where we're not doing so well to begin with. And so that's where you start to see increases, for example, in global poverty or decreases in vaccination rates, things like that. And it makes good sense, right? I mean, there's all these big numbers, and some people don't do so well. Like when we're thinking global, it's kind of hard to think global complexity. But think about what we know from our own lives. Pandemic hits, what happens? Businesses get shut down. People lose their businesses. People get sick and they can't go to work. Well, the same is true for people living in poverty, but even more so because they're more vulnerable, because their jobs may be taken away first, because they're already low income workers, low wage workers. Um, but they also are the ones who are less likely to have job alternatives. They don't have necessarily as much education or skills. They don't necessarily even have any experience navigating that world for themselves, advocating, going and getting something new. And they don't have access to healthcare. And they may be living right on the margin. I mean, we hear these things in the US about, I can't remember what percent of people, but a very significant percent of people in the United States don't have enough money in reserve to weather something like car repairs or a medical illness or something that tips them over into they go into debt, they can't afford it. Think about someone who's living on less than $1.90 a day. They're already below where they need to be, and you take away a job, and we're talking starvation as opposed to not eating out at restaurants, watching what you spend your money on. So those are the kinds of things that we see that make people living in poverty to be considered highest risk. You mentioned the number of people being sunk into poverty. So what we tend to see on the global scale is how many people rise out of poverty or fall into poverty. And what's been really striking, which people often don't know, is that the world has done really well over the past couple decades, right? We have been in this continuing pattern of getting people out of poverty or out of extreme poverty. And that's really hopeful. It's really easy to be depressed about the numbers when we think of how many people live in extreme poverty around the world. But we've been doing a really good job. What's unfortunate now, as you mentioned, is that this is going to be the first time, 2020, I believe, was the first time where that trend reversed, that we had more people going into extreme poverty and on the order of 100 million more getting added. And again, 2021 isn't looking any better. So the world is recognizing, the people who pay attention to this, the World Food Program, UNICEF, everybody is paying attention to this, saying we need to get our acts together and we need to sort of protect and buffer people because we know we don't want to backslide all this progress we've made in the last couple of decades with respect to getting people out of extreme poverty.
When we talk about getting people out of extreme poverty, it seems like the conversation is focusing on parents or adults or the working percentage of those in poverty. Do children who grow up in poverty often stay there the rest of their life? What is the correlation between childhood upbringing and that socioeconomic status?
It certainly can vary depending on what country we're talking about. I'm more familiar specifically with the United States. And what unfortunately we found in the United States is, I always say it's not 100%. Never say never, never say always. So it's not always predictable, but it is getting increasingly easy in the United States to predict a child's future life outcome based on the zip code they're born in, and zip
Okay.
code correlating with sort of the socioeconomic poverty income levels in that community. Okay, so you can break it down by community. So actually, my work tends to focus on what is it that we can do to change that life trajectory for kids who we can say, oh, pretty predictable. I know where you're going to end up. And if you're born into high poverty and you're facing adversity, it doesn't look so good. Okay. And so to answer your question more directly, people are wrestling with what is it about poverty? Okay. And what we find is, first of all, what can be a protective effect against poverty? A caring, responsive adult. I look at a lot around the brain development, and perhaps the single most important factor for helping a child kind of be protected against the effects of poverty, including neurotoxic effects, is the presence of a caring, supportive, responsive adult. All right. So to put that in regular terms, you can have a caring, loving set of parents in a home, and you can grow up poor and still have a great outcome, right? So part of the effort is on how do we help parents learn those basic interactions and ways of dealing with children where they can create a safer, healthier sort of developmental space for children to grow up in, even if they don't have money, even if they don't have all the food that they need. So there's that aspect. But there's also things about food and there's things about education that we can tackle before we can completely solve the poverty, issue itself. So again, it is what I like people to realize is it is not a foregone conclusion that if you're born into poverty, you will be poor. Yes, the deck is stacked against you, but there are lots of things we can do to change those life trajectories for kids. And that is where I spend my time and where a lot of work is being done in all sectors, whether it's nutrition or education or healthcare, those and parenting, all of those sorts of things have a very make a big difference. And again, that's pretty global. We know because it's based on child development, right? And so child development tells us what we need as core basic needs, and poverty beats up on it
Right.
with adult defenses added to children, because young children don't have those defenses. They don't have the resiliency and the skills and the ways of dealing with the adversity. We as adults can help them.
So implementing those solutions in communities seems like it would provide a framework for success for these children. Are there any recent policy measures or social experiments per se that reflect the success of what you're talking about?
Well, absolutely. And one of the places I refer to quite a bit, it's sort of pulling all of these sort of ideas together with the neuroscience as a basis, with child development, with toxic stress and adversity kind of at its core, is the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. And what you find there is cross-disciplinary, right? You've got the economics, the neuroscience, the pediatrics, the education, the parenting, all kind of pulled together, saying, here's what we know children need. Here's what we know children experience when they are faced with adverse childhood experiences. And here's what we study about whether it's, as an example, at the level of detail that this is looked at. When I refer to the neurotoxic effects of poverty, okay, in one aspect, what Harvard Center on Developing Child has looked at is the effects on new memory formation, right, in a developing brain in a child. And when children are faced with threats, and by threats, I would say in the olden days of, human history, you're chased by a saber-toothed tiger, right? High stress, not like you have an exam tomorrow kind of stress, but high stress. But high stress can come from food insecurity, from abuse or neglect or lack of housing or any of those sorts of things. A caring, responsive adult can buffer the body's response to stress. And again, all you have to think about is, how do you respond when you have stress? Your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate might speed up, your hands might get kind of clammy. Think about if that was all the time, constant. You're always under threat. You always feel stressed, like something's going to happen. Okay. A caring, responsive adult can decrease that body's response to a level where you no longer are impairing the hippocampus from forming new memories, because the hippocampus is part of the brain that forms new memories. All of a sudden, do you see how things like what's happening in the outside world and social stressors and things like that can impair learning and brain development and all sorts of things? So again, Harvard Center Developing Child is a great place to look. Another group that I'm involved with, that's, as you referenced, and again, you're sort of wise beyond your years in the way that you're looking at this, because there's been a big shift towards community-centric efforts. Again, when I trained at Michigan and then went to medical school and went into pediatrics, it was a pretty sort of biotechnical kind of era of medicine. And so it was that narrow, sort of more traditional view of medical capabilities. And all of a sudden, we get things like the statistic that of all health outcomes, only 20% are thought to be the result of traditional healthcare aspects. 80% of health outcomes are determined by socioeconomics, behavior, sort of the conditions that you're in, which is what we're talking about. So the shift towards community level is a recognition that we better look at all of these factors that impact outcomes, even if you're just focused on healthcare, even if you're going to be a physician and practicing in medicine. And so a group that I've been collaborating with is purpose-built communities. And actually what they do, and this is where people say, as a pediatrician, how did you get involved in things like mixed income housing, healthy communities, economically healthy communities, and cradle to career education, right? Because what you're doing is you're saying, and then access to health, right? So healthcare, walking to walkable neighborhoods, access to fresh produce, whatever it might be. Each community gets to define it, but they build this sort of community around people. And yes, lots of people are tracking those sorts of outcomes and seeing, and sometimes, by the way, investing in the parent improves outcomes for children, including nutrition, education, health outcomes for the child by building adult capacities. Again, the Harvard Center on Developing Child has a great video, little kind of schematic video that goes over this idea of building adult capacities to improve child outcomes. Because again, we should be considering them as a dyad, as a pair, because the child develops in the context of the people and the environment that they're in.
This is a fascinating new perspective to childhood nutrition, and I know a lot of us don't really consider childhood mental health an aspect of nutrition. But when looking at poverty in the bigger picture, it is clear that these stressors and these factors to a child's life is harming them in more ways than we can even count. And so I think that's really interesting. And another thing I want to touch on is this buffer that you're talking about. And how we can help the parent. Because as the United Nations reports and a ton of different anti-poverty efforts around the world, they want to empower the mother. They want to empower women to help take care of their children. But in the United States, it seems like we've had a little bit different of approach very recently. So the Urban Institute projects that the 2021 poverty um, outlay will be a 13.7% or ratio of 1 in 7 Americans living below the United States defined poverty line. But President Biden did get his $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan approved. And researchers at the University of Columbia predict that anti-poverty measures could cut American childhood poverty in half. So could this help us get rid of childhood poverty in America? And how effective could the plan be if applied in other countries experiencing extreme poverty and childhood nutrition rates?
It is a great question. And in fact, that's where I had intended to go when you asked your previous question, because this American Recovery Act, again, people far more sort of studying poverty and at this kind of big systems level than I am, the researchers who are studying it. Everything I'm hearing is this is huge. This is a huge development for getting kids out of poverty. Half of kids in America out of poverty. And, there's plenty of us who are embarrassed by the fact that we're the richest country in the world and we have as many children living in poverty as we do. What you also touched on, and then I will get to this, how does this scale globally? What you also touched on is this idea of investing in women. And again, for anyone who's listening, especially for students listening, I majored in cellular molecular biology at Michigan, right? And I was hard sciences. I worked in a neuroscience lab. I thought I might be a neurosurgeon. And math was my best subject. I just didn't major in it because I didn't know what I'd do with it, right? How I ended up writing children's books and parenting books and talking about community redevelopment. And to your point about investing in mothers, what I did was I recognized this, if we invest early and that there's this relational aspect, and investing in the adult can help improve child outcomes, maybe more than any medicine I could prescribe or anything I could do specific to the child, is building the capacities of the people who interact every day with the child. You know where that ends me up? Looking at the economics of it, and then things like advocating for paid maternity leave, and things like earned income tax credit, which just got increased and made it so that it was more accessible to the highest poverty families in America. And before those things, I have to admit, those things, more power to the people who focused on them. But I was not excited about things like earned income tax credits until you realize that the money people have access to, the food they have access to, the ability for a parent doesn't to have to work 2 jobs instead of 3 so they have some time, or that they have time off when they have a new baby to really bond and interact and create that warm environment, all impacts child outcomes. So there are a lot of people in my world very, very excited about this idea that for once, not just kind of patching over the effects of poverty, but attacking it and really cutting in half childhood poverty is very exciting. To your question about how does this, could this be applied elsewhere in the world? Well, unfortunately, in the world, we stand alone in terms of developed nations in our lack of supports for working mothers, right? And again, you can get to a lot of the cultural and sociologic aspects of that as well. So that some of what we're doing, we're really kind of behind the rest of the developed world on. But what I like to point out to people doing this work is one of the best things to do, because again, there is this shift from what profession are you in, right? I'm just going to talk about the nutrients. I'm just going to talk about the economics. I'm just going to talk about the medical pediatric aspects, and say, how do we look at it from a child, family, community centric view? Is go into it, and the first thing you need to do, this comes straight from design thinking, like the software world. You empathize, you understand the community you're working with, and then you say, how can we help? Because obviously, if they're low resource and all there's those sorts of, but we can't go in and presume that we know what works. Like, we got the recipe, we figured it out, here you go. It's how can we help you? Very early on in our conversation here, you mentioned access to fruits and vegetables, right? Fresh produce. And one of the initiatives that makes this sort of clear is this idea of, how do you get them to people? What if you live in a food desert where all you have access to is candy and soda or pop in Michigan, right? But how do you deal with that? And if you're talking about a community, a Hispanic community in New York City that only has access to the bodega, you put fresh produce in a bodega, right? Like the little corner store, or you put it at gas stations or at the pharmacies that are on every street corner. And that's where, if you start to look around, you see things like, some bananas and some apples and some other fruits and vegetables and things at places we never used to see them. That's trying to make them more accessible. And last thing I'll say about that, by the way, is the concept holds true across all these realms. Let's get back to the pandemic. We have several vaccines that work, right? And on the one hand, we have to make sure people understand them enough to not be afraid of them. Unfortunately, they became politicized. It's understandable what people don't know about the immune system, which is very complex. But we have unbelievably come up with really effective vaccines in the course of 1 year. So you educate people. The next question is, how do we get it to people? I live right near a hospital. My husband and I are physicians. This is easy. But how do we get them to the people who potentially are most vulnerable or live in the highest poverty rural areas and things? And again, it becomes the same discussion, whether I want to get people fresh produce or I want to get them access to a vaccine. And we can learn a lot from those efforts because we can look at the strategy and the approach. When we do, we're tackling poverty, because poverty makes you more vulnerable to all these things. Climate change, the people who live in areas that are below sea level, least protected, most likely to get hit by the effects of climate change, are people living in poverty, right? So again, that was quite a long, several answers for you, but I love the fact that you're thinking about this. And for anyone who's listening to the conversation, this is to say, you can go and become a nutritionist. You can go and become an economist. You can go and become a pediatrician, and you can actively contribute both at that very specific level, but also in this much broader area. Because deep expertise in each of those areas, the trick is to bring it all together to have the most impact for getting kids out of poverty and tackling global childhood nutrition issues.
That's the most important part of the conversation that we're having is getting people to recognize, especially students with the power now to change their education in whatever way they feel they can best help the world. Have these people understand that there is an economic part, there is a medical part, there is social infrastructure. There are all these different aspects to not only our education, but the power that we have as young people in changing kind of not only the future of how the United States democracy sees others and helps people at all different types of socioeconomic levels, but how we now look at the bigger picture. And the Borgen Project is a nonprofit group that focuses on putting the issue of global poverty at the forefront of US policy. And they began to talk about how fighting poverty improves national security, how innovation and working together can help find new innovative ways where we can like approach this problem from a different perspective. And coming into this conversation with you, I expected to talk about plumpy nut, which is given to malnourished children in Africa,
I've
or
worked with them,
talking
actually. Yeah.
really.
Yes, I've been an advisor for Puppy Nut. Yes.
Okay, so I was expecting you to talk about that, or solar powered machines for family farms. But I think what people really need to understand is that this this crisis affects everybody. It affects, like I said, national security, or it affects your children's mental health or your child's friend's living condition, and also how we perceive a non upper class family in all of these countries. So, beyond education and beyond the specific community aid programs, how can we get people to be more aware, to understand what Plumpy Nut is, or how they can help, or how they can use their education for good?
So you're getting straight into the area where I spend the most time, which is I consider myself somewhat of a glorified translator. And by saying translator, I say, I started at Michigan. I was again cellular molecular biology. So I took biochemistry and loved it, thought this is great, totally understood it, thought it was great, and then realized that all my friends were just memorizing it, right? Didn't have a deeper understanding. So I started tutoring it the next semester, and I could tell it like it's a story and you see this and all the cell biology stuff. And I know that makes me sound like a science geek, but point being that everything I've done since is I was very good at the complex stuff, right? I could do, calculus and it made sense to me intuitively, not just memorizing integrals, but like made sense. So I would then figure out ways to explain it for people who clearly were just memorizing it. The same challenge holds true when you start opening things up to this much broader realm. And the example I like to use now that I live in the middle of Nebraska, right, is it's a bit for me, because one of the cases I've been making lately to make sure that people will support policies investing in all aspects of early childhood and improved life outcomes for children is an appeal to the business and policymakers. And I went, wait a minute, I need to translate all the stuff that we know, whether it's the neuroscience, the nutrition, the breastfeeding, the earned income, into language that people in business and policy will understand, right? And so I translated it, and all of a sudden I find myself speaking at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and at the World Bank and at these areas where I would never, or NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center. So for your question, one of the things that I really hit on, I gave a TED talk in Northern India. If anyone's interested, you can just search my name, Laura Jana, and then put TEDx. And you'll see a TED talk from a few years ago. I think it's about 3 years now, called the Skills Needed to Succeed, or 21st Century Skills Children Need to Succeed, or something like that. Definitely relevant to your generation, because you will be feeling it and living it, which is there are what I call the IQ skills. Those are the content skills, the reading, writing, arithmetic like stuff. So it's coding and math and, kind of all those sorts of things. And I always say still very important. But, if you look at the World Economic Forum, they say those are only 1/3 of the skills you need to succeed in today's world. 2/3 are all these other skills, which have always been seen as, and people call them soft, non-cognitive, and other. And the case I make is not only does soft do them no justice, right? We think soft skills are not really that important. Hard skills really valuable. But we minimize them and we don't pay as much attention to them, but they're the kinds of things that you and I are talking about, which is how do you look at things differently? You need curiosity and critical thinking. And now you need to look globally, which means you need to have perspectives based on which country are we talking about? Are we talking about women and socioeconomics and all these things? You have to have perspective taking. All those other skills, when I was at your level at Michigan, those weren't really highly valued, right? It was math and science and technical and sort of, the things you can grade with a fill in the blank or a numerical answer. But these
Right.
things that are much more reflective and all, what the world is realizing is that those are really important and they can be applied across content areas. So, to people paying attention, go deep in the area you're passionate about, right? It can be things, and if you're passionate about agriculture, you mentioned, go look at the new ways of farming, or co-oping in Africa, where people then helps get them out of poverty, have better crop yields, be able to have some sort of power instead of having the big companies have power over the subsistence farmers. Go for it. But also think about the fact that these skills, the ability to think differently and adapt and use critical thinking and imagine things that haven't been done yet, right? The innovation side of this is now more highly valued than ever. That's the point of my TED talk that I gave. And if you look at what I've been doing, I never in a million years, when I was at Michigan, would have thought that I would be doing the things that I'm doing now. I have people call me and say, how did you get where you are now? Like, I want to do what you're doing. I advise Fortune 100 companies and I do all these things. I never could have predicted it. In fact, my answer is if you tell me where you think I am, I will tell you how I got here. But again, it makes it, and again, the beauty of what you now have, your generation has, is much more of a mix and match, figure out what your major is. You can major in this and minor in this and cross schools and do these things. And you can do global, but you can do local and you can do all these things. It was a lot more sort of rigid, traditional with less options. Go for the mix and match. Go for your passions, but also keep the fact that in mind that we are globally complex. The world is rapidly changing, and that was true before COVID. COVID just is a great example. And when something like that hits, rapid change, globally complex, can't solve the problem just by focusing on your little local, town or school or whatever, that all those other skills will serve you really well.
Well, Dr. Jana, thank you so much for sitting down with me and helping us tackle the complexities of both global poverty and now all of these intricate nuances to childhood nutrition. And at UNICEF we also know that the most vital way to promote change is through education and harnessing your education for good. So, for the rest of our UNICEF initiative on childhood nutrition, we'll be sharing resources on our social media platforms to build on what Dr. Jana told us today. But you can also check out Dr. Laura Jana at Dr. Laura Jana on Twitter and Facebook and drlaurajana.com. At UNICEF we hope that you will stick with us as we continue this conversation about reducing poverty and nourishing children, and that you'll tune into our panel on Wednesday, April 7th, 7 p.m. at Eastern Standard Time. Thank you.